I'd like to go in and introduce our speakers today. We have Dr. Edward Lincoln, who was the director of the Center of Japan-U.S. Business and Economic Studies and professor of economics at the CERN School of Business at Zurich University from 2006 to 2007. He recently just took up a new post teaching East Asian economics at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and he has published widely on the Japanese economy and U.S.-Japan trade relations. He also has publications on East Asian economic regionalism. Professor Lincoln's interests include contemporary structure and the change of the Japanese economy, East Asian economic integration, and U.S. economic policy towards Japan and East Asia. Next to Dr. Lincoln, we have Dr. Hyung-Gon Jeong. Dr. Jeong is currently the head of the Northeast Asian Economic Cooperation Team for the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy in Seoul. He was a member of the Presidential Transition Committee for President Lee Myung-bak and serves as an advisor to the Ministry of National Unification and the National Intelligence Services, among other ministries. Previously, Dr. Jeong was the Director General of the Office of Policy Coordination of the National Security Council in the Office of the President from July to December 2005, and the Director General in the Office of Strategy and Planning of the Office of the National Security Council in the Office of the President from June 2003 to June 2005. At Dr. Jeong's left, we have Dr. Peter A. Petri, who is the Carl J. Shapiro Professor of International Finance at the Brandeis International Business School and a Senior Fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. He served as the Dean of the IBS from its founding in 1994 until 2006 and has held appointments as a Fulbright Research Scholar and visiting scholar at the OECD, the Brookings Institution, Keio University in Tokyo, Fudan University in Shanghai as well. He has also consulted for the World Bank, the OECD, the Asian Development Bank, APEC, and agencies of the United Nations and the United States as well as other countries. So as you can see, we have a very well credentialed and talented panel here to take and discuss a lot of issues of great importance. We will start off with Dr. Lincoln, who will talk about the evolution of U.S. trade policy, and then Dr. Petri will discuss some of the differences and some of the modeling results for the different agreements, either ASEAN +6 or TPP and other arrangements. And then we will move to Dr. Jeong, who will take and discuss some additional modeling results, but also take a look at some of the different countries' positions on each of these agreements. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Lincoln.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start with an apology. I'm an economist, but what I'm talking about is almost more the realm of political science than it is economic, the American trade policy toward Northeast Asia. And let me further apologize by saying that since I am an economist rather than a political scientist, I'm going to start my part of this panel by talking about why we're here to begin with and the position that economists have taken regarding international trade and how it ought to be organized. And I think that that will fit in quite nicely to the other two presentations. So to begin with, economists have been advocating free trade, that there be no tariff or other barriers to international trade since 1775, starting with Adam Smith. Adam Smith proposed something called the theory of absolute advantage. A few decades later, David Ricardo modified it and created the theory of comparative advantage, which is actually was a very, very powerful and revolutionary idea, which says basically one country can be better, more efficient at manufacturing everything, and both it and another country can benefit from international trade. So you can be worse than the other country at manufacturing everything, and you still benefit from international trade. It took a long time to get people to begin to believe that. And this theory, by the way, then went through further evolution in the 20th century. Two guys named Heckscher and Olean came up with theories about what countries should end up importing and exporting. Paul Samuelson came along around 1950 and added a lot of mathematical precision to all of this. Paul Krugman essentially got his Nobel Prize in Economics for work that he did on trade policy in the 1970s and 80s. But all of this, although it refines the basic ideas, leaves the economics profession solidly in support in the idea that free trade is best for all countries. That concept, or at least one element of that concept, is embodied in the post-World War II institutional framework that we have for international trade, which started off as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, 1947, gets transformed into the World Trade Organization, 1994. And that says that there's a principle called most favored nation. That if I offer you a lower tariff on importing your automobiles into my country, I have to offer that same reduced tariff to every other member of the WTO. And that, in a sense, comes out of this notion that free trade's a good thing. So if we're going to do it, let's not pick and choose who we do it with. It should be with everybody. There's a political history here as well, but I won't get into that. Having established that fundamental principle, however, the GATT incorporated a huge exception to it. This is Article 24 of the GATT, which says, under one circumstance, we will allow an exception to most favored nation. And that is that if two countries or several countries get together and agree to remove substantially all, is the term used, substantially all barriers to trade between them, then that's okay. So I can't go to you and say, for your automobiles, I'm going to give you a lower tariff than cars coming in from other countries. But if the two of us agree that not just automobiles, but everything or almost everything that we trade will be traded tariff-free, then that's okay. Why was this exception put in there? I'm actually not really sure, but my guess is it was because of the British Empire, which still existed in 1947. And the British had something, in fact, continued it on, even as their empire collapsed, a thing called the imperial preference system. So the former British Empire remained essentially a huge free trade area until the 1970s, when Britain joined the EU, and as part of that was asked to dismantle its relationship with its former colonies. The Australians were not pleased with that. Very little use was made of this exception to most favored nation principle until we get to the 1980s. Since the mid to late 1980s, agreements among either pairs or small groups of countries have proliferated. This has generated a huge debate among economists over the last 30 years. And I think initially economists were not pleased with this movement because there are a number of economic problems with having a free trade arrangement or a preferential trade arrangement among pairs of countries. The biggest objection is something called trade diversion. That because the two of us have no tariff on the trade between us, it will bias our trade toward that favored partner, even though a company in some other country around the world may be the most efficient producer of that product. And so that introduces a distortion, a global distortion in the location of production around the world. A second issue is that, as a matter of practical reality, every single one of these agreements is different. Right? And part of that has to do with Article 24 that says substantially all. What does substantially all mean? Loosely, the WTO seems to think it means 90% of all your trade should move duty-free. Some agreements have been a little bit less than that. But what is the 10% that's not covered under the agreement? That changes from agreement to agreement to agreement. This creates something that Jagdish Bhagwati, one of the most senior trade economists in the United States, has argued that this is the so-called spaghetti bowl effect. We're just creating a mess, right? That it imposes a burden on corporations to say, well, I'd like to import something from country X. What rules apply? Are we in an FTA? Are we not in an FTA? So it complicates life in the business sector. A third issue, somewhat related to that, is something called rules of origin. If I have a 5% tariff on imported automobiles, it doesn't matter where they come from in the world, it's a real simple process. Automobile comes in, we pay a 5% tariff on it. If I import an automobile from my free trade partner, I have to ask the question, is that automobile really manufactured in my partner country? And so the rules of origin specify how much domestic value added there must be in order for it to be classified as a product of that country. Right? So we have NAFTA, for example. So if I'm an American company and I import men's T-shirts from China, and in the United States, all I do is put them in packages of 3 in a plastic bag with a label on the bag, and I ship them to Canada. And the question is, how are the Canadians going to treat that? Was that an American product? Well, the plastic bag might be from the United States, but the T-shirts are not. And so you have to add it up and find out how much of the final value of that product was added in the United States. This, aside from adding an additional complication, introduces a different kind of complication, which is that you can be challenged. There can be disputes. I don't like what you're doing. I don't like that your product's coming into my country, and so I'm going to challenge you on whether it really deserves to get this duty-free treatment. And so to handle these disputes, you have to have a dispute resolution mechanism. Basically a court kind of system with judges, presentations, and provides employment to a lot of lawyers who are the ones who are going to argue these cases. So again, economists, at least initially, were rather skeptical of the value of free trade areas. However, over the last 30 years, I think there has been an increasing number of arguments on the other side. First of all, in a theoretical sense, in addition to trade diversion, there is trade creation. I start importing products from a trade partner that there's no import duty. The final price of those products in my market is going to be lower than it was before. Consumption of those products increases. Net national welfare in the importing country increases. Again, in theoretical terms, what you want to do is to subtract the cost of trade diversion from the positive benefit of trade creation to figure out whether the free trade area is a net plus or minus. But at least it opens the possibility that the trade creation effects may be bigger than trade diversion. Number 2, the WTO has become very unwieldy. Right? The Doha round started in 2001. We're now in the 11th year of the negotiations for the Doha round, and it's not finished. That's a long time. And so it might be better to have an agreement that you can knock out in a year or two with some favored partners rather than waiting this very long time to get an improvement at the global level. Number 3. If a free trade area has more than 2 countries in it, say 3, 4, 5, the probability that trade creation will outweigh trade diversion starts to go up because it's more likely that an efficient producer of products is located inside that group, and so we're not diverting world production away from efficient producers. Number 4, there's a political aspect to this that you might call the envy effect. Fred Bergson would call it the building block effect, which is that you and I create a free trade area, And some of our other friends around the world become very envious of it. Say, hey, wait a minute, how come you didn't include me? And then they want to get in, and so the whole process may grow and develop to a point where maybe most countries end up on the inside, if you're really optimistic. And I think we'll hear more about those possibilities later in this panel. The final reason to favor these agreements is foreign direct investment and services trade. Trade in services has become more important over time around the world. Economists 50, 60 years ago would say, we don't trade services because services have to be produced where they are consumed. Well, yeah, but we do have trade in certain kinds of services. Hollywood movies, for example. Royalties paid back to the United States when Hollywood films are shown abroad is a form of services transaction. And foreign direct investment, both for manufacturing and services, this is quite important. Foreign direct investment is not covered under the WTO. We've talked about it from time to time, but there have never been rules established. Services trade is now included in the WTO, but the general agreement on trade and services is very broad, rather weak. It's one of the things that's being discussed in the Doha round, but it may take a long time before we get there. So I would say that today, the balance of opinion among economists has shifted away from kind of an initial knee-jerk reaction of saying these kinds of special carve-outs are a bad idea, to at least a lot of economists, whether it's the majority, I don't know, but a lot of economists today saying, yeah, really, there's nothing wrong with this. The benefits outweigh the costs that are involved. Jagdish Bhagwati at Columbia University continues to be a very outspoken critic of these things, including being a big critic of TPP. But I just casually, I don't hear a lot of other voices being raised against it anymore. Okay, so that's my obligatory economics history introduction to all of this. So where is the United States, and how has the United States gotten to where it is today? And here I'm going to try to put on my political science hat. My apologies if, in fact, you think I don't deserve to be a political scientist. So the starting point here is that to understand American trade policy toward Asia, you have to start with the strategic context. Ever since the end of World War II, the United States has regarded itself as a key strategic player in Asia, and that economic policy toward Asia should be developed within that overarching context. The initial approach of the United States to the region was something called the hub and spoke policy, right? We had separate individual alliances with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, with other countries around the region. We did not develop a region-wide approach like NATO. We tried it with the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, but that failed. So the U.S. went down this hub and spoke idea. That means that, at least initially, the United States was not interested in any kind of regional trade policy with Asia. That began to change over the 1980s. And I'm going to have to speed up here because I can see I spent so much time on my favorite topic of economic theory that I may run out of time. But U.S. policy began to change in the 1980s, in part because the U.S. was concerned that East Asia might just go off by itself. Prime Minister Mahathir was this, the spokesperson for something called the East Asian Economic Caucus, and that got the U.S. very worried. We saw that as detrimental to our strategic policy in the region. We were also wary of the rise of Japan. If there was a regional organization in Asia without us and with Japan, that would benefit Japanese firms at a time when Americans viewed Japan as being on an economic rise and displacing American firms around the world anyway. There were a variety of reasons why the U.S. decided that maybe we should get involved economically with the region on a regional basis, and so we joined APEC. It was not an American idea. It was the Australians and the Japanese who had pushed the creation of APEC, but we joined. Once we joined, we tried to push APEC hard in the direction of becoming something sort of like a free trade area, but that failed. In 1997, there was an agreement called the Early Voluntary Sectoral Liberalization Policy, and it did not go through. So I think that strategically we're still kind of in the same position, that we understand the value of interacting with East Asia on a regional basis economically. We would prefer to have something that does involve us rather than something that does not. The second thing that's going on has been the rise of services and foreign direct investment. I won't bore you with the numbers, just suffice it to say that the United States has experienced a huge increase in investment by American firms around the world over the years, and a very rapid increase in American services exports. And so with those becoming more important, having a policy, pursuing free trade agreements in which we can hammer out agreements on services and foreign direct investment became increasingly desirable for the United States. Hang on here. So, since I am running out of time, let's conclude then. Where does this leave us today for the United States with TPP? So, the U.S. government has embraced TPP, and it has lots of reasons for doing that. Right? Strategically, it suits our purposes because it includes the United States. Just as in the 1980s, the U.S. government it gets a little nervous about the idea of, say, an agreement that is, well, you could take the three, Korea, Japan, China. You could take ASEAN plus 3. You could have ASEAN plus 6. None of them include the U.S. That is both detrimental to U.S. firms. We would suffer from the trade diversion effect, but also, and more importantly, it's not in our strategic interest. Second, that this is, again, an opportunity to pursue services and foreign direct investment in a part of the world where I think American firms see rapidly rising markets where they ought to be involved. It helps to answer our disappointment with Doha. Just a couple other things. Well, maybe I'll skip this one and leave it for questions, which is that China is not in TPP. And this is a way of maybe putting some pressure on China, either strategically or at least economically, saying, TPP is going to be a good thing. You're not in it because you frankly don't deserve to be in it yet. But we're going to create it, and maybe we can draw you into it later on. It also is a way to re-engage with Japan now that Japan has expressed interest in joining it. We have not had serious trade negotiations with Japan for at least 15 years. And this would be a way to re-engage Japan and get it to open up some problematic areas of its market. So for all of these reasons, my sense is that the U.S. government has relatively enthusiastically embraced TPP and would much prefer to see that moving forward than some alternative to that. So with 1 minute to go, I will stop at that point. So I think that pretty much concludes it. Dr. Petri?
Good. How do I do that?
Just over here. The left.
There's a microphone up there, so you can use that.
Okay, let me do it. I switch there then. Should be putting up. Good. Thank you very much. I mean, I think Ed has actually covered a fair amount of the sort of structural context in which I want to present my comments. And I know that Dr. Jeong will, in fact, deal more specifically with the implications for Korea and other countries. So I'm in a good position. I can talk here in the middle about what I think of as, what I think the kind of basic motivating issues are in thinking about the TPP. Let me say, first of all, and Ed referred to this, the TPP is not happening in a vacuum. There is at the same time a very solid track of negotiations going on in Asia based on the ASEAN grouping. And as I will suggest later in my conversation, the TPP track and this Asian track, and that's essentially the purpose of my study, is to look at these in parallel, are having a great deal of influence on each other, almost from the beginning. And the moves are clearly very closely correlated. I think for the best, but that's an issue that remains to be seen, and that's what I want to address. It's a very controversial set of parallel initiatives. As Ed mentions, it's sort of natural that one should have something like this in the wake of the Doha round falling apart. But it's still very controversial in Asia. Some people see it as a way for the United States to try to divide the region, to kind of create a set of alliances at the expense of China. In the United States, people see China and the Asian track as an effort to exclude the United States. So this is a way to try to get back to preserve a strong economic set of economic linkages. So there's a lot of controversy around it. And the question in all of this is, where is all this leading? There is, for the time being, a great deal of tension, but is that for the better? Is that kind of positive competitive tension, or is it the precursor of something that might lead to the division of the region? The kind of undercurrent of this paper is that this is fundamentally a game. Not a game in the trivial sense, and certainly not a game that's fun for the people who are involved in it, and the negotiators who are involved in both tracks, I know are in fact face very difficult challenges. But it's a game in the economics definition of it, in the sense that it involves strategic decisions by countries which influence the environment in which the other country operates. So these decisions are not just decisions that countries take lightly, because they ultimately set the course for what might be down the road fairly substantial changes in the environment. They're essentially setting a course for the future, and how that course is set may have a lot to do with what the benefits, economic and otherwise, are involved in the eventual outcomes. So in that sense, it's very important to try to get some prediction for whether this is a game that's likely to lead to, and the theory is very quiet on this. The theory could go both ways. Whether this is a game that's likely to lead to collisions in the end, a division of the region into two blocks, or whether it's one rather that's more likely to lead to a consolidated, integrated, and hopefully more open regional trading environment. I'm on the second of these points, but it's by no means obvious at this point that that's where this is going to lead. But I will try to provide some evidence, and much of this comes from modeling work that the three of us have done, Mike Plummer, Jai Fan, and I. That suggests that, in fact, there is a lot about the dynamics that leads to a positive collaborative outcome, consolidation in the end, rather than division. Here are the takeaways just very quickly. Well, as I mentioned already, the global stalemate in negotiations has stimulated very active negotiations on both tracks. The tracks are, at least initially, quite competitive. But as I will argue, they are ultimately not about dividing the regional economy, but about figuring out under what rules it will be operating. In other words, they're really about trying to set rules for cooperation rather than conflict. So that's I think what is emerging here. Those rules are quite different on the Asian and the Trans-Pacific tracks. I think quite predictably so. We can understand why Asian economies are following one template for negotiations, while the Trans-Pacific agreement and other prior Trans-Pacific agreements have followed a different one. The Asian template is softer in the sense that it covers fewer areas, often with less deep liberalization, more exceptions. I will show you some evidence for this in a second. But its advantage is that countries can join relatively early in their development process. Different countries find it easier to cooperate if each can leave exceptions for its more sensitive industry. So it's softer, but it can potentially move faster in an environment where there are great differences among countries. The TPP template, or the template that has tended to characterize Trans-Pacific agreements, has more areas of cooperation. It will include newer issues, for example, services, investment, government procurement are among them, as well as some social issues like labor and environment. So it covers more issues, it's much more ambitious, it requires more legal disciplines, and it is much harder to implement across a diverse group of economies. But at the same time, because it leads to deeper liberalization for all of the reasons that Ed mentioned, we tend to argue that it's likely to lead to much larger benefits. And that's what we show with models. The models are based on very much the neoclassical paradigm that introduced them. Although I want to add to that, they're based on the neoclassical paradigm, but on its latest version, which is in fact not what most other models have been using. Final conclusion is that in all of this, dynamic effects are really what we're looking for, how the tracks influence their own development, what kind of momentum they generate, and how they influence each other. Why is all of this important? I think we know the answer to this, and I'll go over this slide very quickly. The Pacific is the world's trading hub. And APEC countries, and that's sort of one definition, a useful definition, 21 countries on both sides of the Pacific, account for about 2/3 of world trade, either as an importer or exporter, or often both. It is also the world's fastest growing region by a good couple of percentage points faster than the rest of the world. So if one is going to look for a solution to the Doha dilemma, this is the place where it's likely to emerge. The Asian track follows very extensive market-based liberalization and integration in the region. It is likely to become more important for the region as it rebalances its economies toward its own markets. And it has a set of institutions in place. The ASEAN institutions have been remarkably resilient. They're growing, they're dynamic, albeit they don't quite have the degree of formalism that some of the institutions, that the TPP and the global institutions have. The Trans-Pacific track has importance too because it would re-engage the U.S. in the region in a positive way. It offers a very comprehensive template which addresses not only border issues but often the regulations that impede trade beyond the border. And it addresses, most importantly, rising sectors. These are sectors that are important for the United States, but eventually will be important for other advanced countries, already are for countries like Japan and Korea in the region. And they make it also possible for this great specialization to continue without sort of undue resistance from the countries which are shifting into these new industries. For them to shift into those industries, they have to be liberalized as well as the manufacturing sectors in which they are important importers. The TPP will also address some of the political issues that are needed both in the United States and other advanced countries and in some of the emerging economies to make it politically viable. In the advanced countries, this is likely to involve things like labor and the environment. In the emerging economies, they have their issues too, where it's more likely to involve small and medium enterprises, technology transfers, and support for small industry development, for industries fitting into global supply chains. And it's likely to have some of each so that the agreements become politically viable in all member countries. Now let me turn briefly to what's different about these two templates. This is a graph about tariffs, and it shows the degree of reduction in tariffs in years after the agreement is put into force. So, for example, you see that 15 years out, a long time out, both the Asian and the Trans-Pacific agreements, and this is based on a study of some 40 different agreements, both Asian and Trans-Pacific agreements, on average, tend to liberalize a great deal of the tariff protection. But the Trans-Pacific track tends to liberalize more, so that there are maybe 3% tariffs left instead of 5 or 8% under the Asian track. And you have to remember that the Trans-Pacific track is cutting tariffs which are already, for the most part, lower to begin with. So the amount of barriers left in place is considerably larger under typical Asian agreements than it is on Trans-Pacific agreements. The differences are even more striking if you look at specific provisions that deal with non-tariff barriers. And what this is based on is, again, a study of about 40 agreements among the APEC countries. Each bar represents a score that we have assigned to 24 to how well the agreement covers each of 24 issue areas. So, for example, you will see that the IPR, intellectual property rights, in the blue bar are covered by close to 100%. You get close to 100% score in a typical and here the distinction is U.S. versus ASEAN agreements, just to make the contrast especially sharp. In a typical U.S. agreement, in the Korea-U.S. agreement, in the Australia-U.S. agreement, you tend to get very rigorous IPR coverage, which, according to the methodology we use, gives you a score of 98. A typical ASEAN agreement will have an IPR score something closer to 20%. This is, by the way, based on a very interesting database that APEC collected. You can actually look at what an agreement does in each of 1,500 specific areas where you could have provisions, and we did things like counting the percentage of the provisions that are actually addressed in an agreement. We've added to that a WTO database which says in these issue areas to what extent the agreement leads to enforceable standards, to what extent it doesn't. So it is it's not great, but it's as good as you can do in as much detail as you can get at this point on what's happening on the two tracks. The point is you see very big differences between the tracks, and this idea that the Asian agreements tend to be softer, they tend to have more narrower coverage and apply to fewer issues, and also tend to have softer coverage of those issues can be demonstrated quite rigorously quantitatively. It's also a major dilemma in sort of what kind of agreement do you want? Do you want an agreement which broadly includes everybody and then moves them up together? Or do you want a very rigorous agreement which initially includes a small group of countries and then is expanded later on? But there are these big differences. Now, how are these tracks interacting? I think there are very important and large interactions between them. For example, the TPP itself, as I've mentioned by many Americans, is seen as a reaction to the ASEAN+ framework of agreements. Since the TPP negotiations intensified, the China, Japan, Korea trilateral free trade area proposal, the study of it was accelerated, completed. They will begin negotiations expected in May. They have also apparently concluded an investment agreement among the three countries, which will be also unveiled or signed in May. So you've seen those reactions. ASEAN has produced an ASEAN++ template, which would guide future negotiations, as the TPP is intended to guide negotiations, but with a set of provisions which are based more comfortable for ASEAN countries. So it is generating, in fact, a great deal of activity, and both tracks appear to be expanding. The TPP track, Malaysia joined very early on, and of course Canada, Japan, and Mexico have now indicated their interest. Korea is sort of a big question mark in everyone's mind. and we'll hear more about that, I'm sure, later. But the numbers, which I get to in a second, give us a clue why it is doing what it's doing. Let me tell you what we did, and then give you a few results. Having mapped all of the provisions of all of the existing free trade agreements in the Asia Pacific, both Trans-Pacific and Asians, we imputed what a TPP might look like, or what a broader Asian track agreement that incorporates all of the countries in the region might look like. In other words, we gave them scores that are similar to the scores that those countries had reached in recent agreements that they have concluded in the past. So we have imputed essentially a nature of what these agreements might look like, then ran them through a comprehensive general equilibrium model. It's got a lot of bells and whistles, which I don't want to describe to you. I can't describe to you in a very short time. But we have papers that go in some depth into this. But both in terms of the treatment, the sophistication of the treatment of the individual agreements, and in terms of the modeling framework that we use, which allows, for example, for there to be productivity differences within countries in particular industries, it represents, it sort of builds in all of the things that we know such modeling ought to do, but has not been possible in the past. So here are the results. First of all, the first result is that this agreement is big. It's likely to look as big as the Doha Round 1 point, the kind of world ultimate effects, if you get to its endpoint, which is not the TPP alone, but the TPP ultimately combining, consolidating with the Asian track in an FTAAP or a region-wide free trade agreement. That would be very big, roughly around $1.2 trillion. Second result is that on the way there, actually the Asian track looks like it produces more benefits. It's less rigorous, but it includes more countries, and it covers more trading relationships on which there is not already an FTA in place. So it covers more countries which have relatively high barriers and don't yet have FTAs. Most important of those being the China, Japan, Korea trilateral FTA. It covers a lot of trade, which is still quite heavily protected. That's why the Asian track looks very attractive, if it can be made to work. A third result is that the economies that really do best in this game are the ones that can play both sides. Malaysia, Korea, possibly, Japan, possibly. In other words, economies that can be both part of the ASEAN+ framework and part of the TPP framework. They will get access to the North American markets, they will get access to the Chinese markets, and of course they'll get access to other Asian markets. In fact, if you look at the actual results, just by doing all this, they don't need the final step, the FTAAP. They will get about 80% of the benefits that they could possibly get out of region-wide free trade just by doing these kind of stepwise things. But the counterpart of that is that if you look at China and the United States, they don't do very well on these smaller tracks. They need the region-wide free trade system. For the U.S., the benefits would be roughly 3 times as large if from an FTAAP than from the TPP pushed as far as it can be pushed. For China, the benefits from an FTAAP would be about 4 times as large as from an Asian track pushed as far as it can be pushed. So, last slide is what we think these results suggest is a kind of time sequence of strategic moves. First step involves competition between these 2 different tracks. The United States will do its best to line up new countries, even though the negotiations, for example, here with Canada are going to be really tough. Even you wouldn't expect them to be, but they will be. China will do its best to attract Korea and other partners to the Asian track, and we will have a kind of progressive enlargement, and the 2 tracks will reinforce each other by competing for members in this initial stage. Second stage, each track will become bigger, but as larger economies like Korea and Japan join both tracks, they will generate greater benefits, A, for the smaller countries, but B, also to some extent for the large leaders, China and the United States. And then comes the last track. Everybody's now in both tracks except for China and the United States. And they will look at each other one day and they say, this doesn't make sense. Why should everyone else have open access to both of our markets, but not at the expense of giving away preferences to others, but not to each other? And that's what we argue. At that point, the benefits will be very large. You know, this is a very short way of telling the story. A lot of other things are going to happen between now and then, including, I would hope, some liberalization of the Chinese economy, also some adjustments in the American economy that will make it more comfortable with its Asian trading relationships. But the bottom line is, this looks to us, based on the results, as a very positive scenario, because ultimately the benefits argue very strongly for regional integration, and the steps there seem to increase the viability of that final consolidation. Thanks. Sorry about violating your time constraints.
Actually, you were 1 minute over, so. Close enough. Okay. Do you want to make? Oh, you want to do it there? Do you want me to put the slides up? Still over. Okay.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeong from KIEP. It is a great privilege to participate in this meaningful international conference. And I would like to thank all the KI staffs who organized this conference for me. So the title of my presentation is TPP or ASEAN+6, which is preferable for Korea. So as you may well aware, since 1990, the regional trade agreement has spread so rapidly, and 224 FTAs were reported to WTO by late 2011. And East Asian countries are pursuing very actively the FTAs with many countries. In China and Japan, Korea have concluded the FTAs with ASEAN and also with individual ASEAN countries. So positive attitude of these Asian countries toward FTA has contributed to trade liberalization to open more market in the East Asian countries. And also the discussions regarding the East Asian economic integrations are becoming more and more active. But the integration in East Asia, however, is very difficult to achieve because of the clash of the interest between China and Japan. China is now promoting to establish an economic bloc within the ASEAN+3, while Japan prefers ASEAN+6 framework. So now the discussions on this East Asian economic integration entered a new phase as Japan expressed its willingness to participate in TPP at APEC meeting last year. So TPP was launched by Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore and Brunei, and has become one of the leading economic integration systems in the Asia-Pacific region. So the United States, and Australia, and Malaysia, and Peru and Vietnam are participating in the negotiations, and Japan and the Canada and Mexico have declared their interest. And President Obama has suggested to Korea join the TPP also. But in response to the recent development of TPP, China is shifting toward the integration through the ASEAN+6, and all these changes in trade environment in East Asia will have a great impact on the future of East Asian economic integration and also future of Korean economy as well. So in my paper, I have tried to figure out which of the two, TPP or ASEAN+6, will be beneficial for Korea. So before we discuss the expected effect of the two different economic blocks on Korean economy, I would like to give you a brief information about the main economic indicators of ASEAN+6 and TPP. So the ASEAN+6 accounts for 49% of the world population, which is considerably larger than 12.1% of TPP. And on the other hand, ASEAN+6 accounts for 27.4% of the world GDP, which is much lower than 41% of TPP. In the case of trade volume, the two different blocks have similar trade volumes. ASEAN+6 accounts for 27%, 28%. TPP accounts for about 29%. Regarding the intra-regional trade volume, Korea's export and import to ASEAN+3 or 6 have been increasing so rapidly, while the same with TPP countries has declining dramatically. So as I mentioned, the purpose of my presentation is figure out which is more beneficial for Korea. So to do this, the macroeconomic effect of the TPP and ASEAN+6 was estimated with the CG model. And Korea can expect 2.69% in actual GDP growth if FTA is signed with ASEAN+6. In the case of TPP, Korea can expect 1.4%. Regarding the changes of welfare, Korea can expect from the ASEAN+6 much more than that of TPP. So only from the perspective of the current economic relations, it is more desirable for Korea to come to the FTA with ASEAN+6. But if TPP is signed as a high standard FTAs that will lead the global economy, then we have to consider to participate in TPP. The question is now, can TPP become a high standard FTA that leads the global economy? To have an answer to this question, we have to first clarify what the high standard FTA is. Unfortunately, there is no clear definition on this high standard FTAs. Even WTO is not able to establish this definition. But we can say that a free trade agreement is then a high standard FTA if a country is open to more than 90% of the total trade share to the counterpart country. So the question is now, have the P4 country, initiator of the TPP, opened more than 90%? This is first question. The second question is, has the agreement reached a higher level of trade liberalization in bilateral FTAs signed with other countries before they join the TPP? Third question is, does their agreement show higher standard compared to the US-led negotiations with latecomer 5 countries? Regarding first and second question, the P4 countries have been more positive toward opening their markets than they were when they each signed bilateral FTAs as an individual countries. Singapore and Brunei and New Zealand, these countries took an active open door policies even before the P4 negotiations. But the Chile is different from these 3 countries. Chile was able to achieve the market opening through the TPP participation. A good example is in the Chile's FTA with Canada and Australia, Chile excluded dairy products from the target items, but in agreement with the New Zealand, it abolished 100% of the import tariffs. And Chile only selected around 75% of the total import from the Canada as customs-free items, but Chile liberalized import for 90% of the items from the New Zealand and Singapore. And also the TPP, at the TPP P+ negotiation with Australia, Chile agreed to import 97% of the import items customs-free. So that we can say that all the P4 countries opened more than 90% of the markets. And so we can also we can say that also the P4 agreement is a high standard FTA regarding the commodity sectors. Then how about the non-tariff barriers. And how about the service industries? Regarding the non-tariff barriers, the level of openness is relatively high. The P4 countries have not applied any strong trade remedy measures to P4 partner countries. Here, the Chile is an exception. Chile is different from the P3 countries because Chile has reused the trade remedy measures to the other countries, but Chile did not apply these trade remedy measures to the P4 partner countries. So we can say that this is also high quality FTA. Regarding the service industry, the P4 countries are showing ambivalent attitude. So an example is Singapore. Singapore fully opened its service industry and service market to the United States in its free trade agreement with the United States. But Singapore was reluctant and restrictive to open the service market to the P4 country. So in some sectors they are liberalized the service sectors, but in some sectors they are very restrictive. But still, we can say that this is also a high quality FTAs. Now, the concern is whether the P5 additional countries will be able to conclude the high quality FTAs that is more open than the P4 agreement. Now, let's look at the feasibility of the PPP by examining the position of each participating country. So first, the position of the United States. The United States is promoting TPP in earnest as a platform for transition to FTA to the APEC. One of the reasons why the United States started to take an interest in a TPP is because the P4 agreement included all or many of the conditions that were unable to be included in existing FTAs. United States aimed to introduce a platinum standard that covers all the items through the negotiation of the TPP. And Chile and Australia have also concluded the FTA in the bilateral FTA with the United States. And these countries are participating also in the TPP negotiations. So the United States wants to promote the additional negotiations on some sensitive sectors within the multilateral framework. And the United States aims to provide a reference point that is capable of introducing transformation in China's trade and industrial structure and drawing China's large state-owned enterprises into the competitive market system. And regarding the positions of Japan, there are three main reasons behind Japan's interest in joining the TPP. First, Japan is planning to use participation in the TPP as a platform toward open Japan. Japan regards the participation of the TPP as a strategic means to revitalize the economy. Second, Japan sees an opportunity to change its industrial structure, especially in agriculture sectors that has heavily relied on the government subsidies for a long time. Third, Japan recognized the TPP as a strategic opportunity to check the future expansion strategies of Korea and China and to occupy a leading position within the East Asian economic cooperation. China's position is clear. China prefers always the autonomous interaction in East Asia without any interference from the United States. China has expressed the antipathy toward the U.S. promotion of the TPP. But the possibility of China's joining the TPP cannot be ruled out because all the PPP member countries, even including the United States, believe that any countries should be able to participate freely if it simply accepts the level of the openness, market opening, and the trade and investment liberalization required. What is the position of the Korea? So as I mentioned earlier, the economic benefits are larger in ASEAN+6 compared to the TPP. And we have very strong economic relations with the ASEAN countries. And the drive for the future economic is bigger in the East Asian region. And also Korea has signed FTAs with major TPP members, the United States, Chile, Peru, and Singapore, and is conducting FTA negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. So there's no big incentives for Korea to join the TPP. There's some argument that Korea should first join the TPP because the ASEAN+6 has only been conceptualized while the TPP is already at the negotiating stage. Moreover, the TPP negotiations are expected to follow the standard of the Chorus FTA, which includes all the Korea's sensitive items, sensitive sectors. So Korea will not experience major difficulties after joining the TPP. This is the argument for the joining the TPP. But I have to figure out here in my paper three major points, three important factors for joining the TPP for Korea. First, whether or not Japan joins TPP as important factors. Okay. It is unlikely that Japan joins TPP immediately because joining the TPP means the full elimination of tariffs on all sectors, commodity sectors, and agricultural sectors. But there is very strong internal resistance within the Japanese society, and the government's, Japanese government's reserved negotiating attitude. All this kind of will make it very difficult to come to the FTA, conclusions of the negotiations. But as I mentioned many times, if TPP is concluded as a high standard FTA, and at the same time Japan joins in the TPP, then we have to consider to join the TPP. Because in that case, Korea's competitiveness will be weakened compared to Japanese product in the TPP member countries. This is not because of Korea's competitiveness, it's because of the openness, high level of the openness of the TPPs. Second, whether or not China joins TPP is also important factors because why ASEAN+6 brings much more benefit to Korea is because of China. China is the number one trading partner for Korea, and China's position as a consumer market and producer will become stronger in the future. So if China joins the TPP, then we have to join the TPP. But it is unlikely China joins TPP in a short-term period because China cannot accept simply all the platinum standard. However, if TPP expand and Korea and Japan join the TPP and some other East Asian countries like Malaysia and Vietnam or some other countries join the TPP, then a new market and new production network will be formed within TPP. And in this situation, China's position will be weakened. This is maybe a trigger China's joined in the TPP. Lastly, the level of openness in TPP is the critical factor for joining in deciding of the Korea's decision, in decision of the Korea's joining for TPP. So, if TPP agreement is concluded under the more favorable conditions than the Chorus FTAs or the Korea-EU FTA, then we have to consider to join this. The United States is now taking the stand of the Chorus FTA as a basic template instead of the existing standard before. There are intense debate on this issue between the TPP member countries, but the United States still intends to apply the same standard of the IPR in TPP as they demanded in Chorus FTA. Anyway, whether they can conclude the high quality FTA is important factors, but I believe that it is unlikely that the TPP will be concluded as a high standard FTA because there's a big differences in economic development. There's a big difference in institutional development among the big countries. So the conclusion is, for Korea is, my conclusion is, the situation for Korea is not urgent with regard to its TPP participation. So Korea should not be hasty in determining the pros and cons regarding the TPP. It would be wiser to take some time in deciding while examining the future agenda of the TPP and the ongoing involvement of China and Japan. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all three of you for three very excellent presentations. And I have to say, having read all of the papers a couple times now, I've read through different parts to look back through to see sort of, make sure I had the right impressions in certain sections and everything. They're very well thought out and very well researched. With that in mind, I'd like to take a few minutes, try to raise a few other points, make a few comments on some of the papers and everything. But I think where I'd like to start is actually with perhaps to frame some of it, a question that I've been asked by actually more than one Korean official. And while it was asked to me in reference to TPP, I think it would probably also apply to ASEAN+6 or any variant thereof, which is basically, why should we do it? Their question to me is, and this is something Dr. Jeong touched on, basically was, we have bilateral agreements with many of these countries. Why do we need to join a larger one? So if you look at, ASEAN+6, they have their own ASEAN agreement. They have an FTA with India. There's been talks off and on with Japan. They're going to start the bilateral with China probably in June. So, the question becomes, does Korea need to join either of these? And then it raises the more interesting question, which I think gets to sort of Dr. Petri's paper and everything, which is that what if Korea or Japan or the others decides to basically not become involved because of their other options? What does that mean then for broader Asian integration? I also, when I look back and I look at sort of some of the pairings that are going on and everything, I'm personally rather skeptical of the Korea-China-Japan FTA. All of my discussions, at least with officials in Seoul, and some of these as recently as a couple months ago, were essentially that Korea's preference would be to not actually do a trilateral FTA, and that they're only doing one with China right now bilaterally because they're being basically pushed into it. So I wonder if maybe that track is sort of perhaps less solid than we may think. So you have that sort of these dynamics going on right now and everything. One of the other things that I'm somewhat interested in your thoughts are sort of out of the countries involved, are there any countries that could be essentially tipping points or decision makers in the process? And what I mean by that is essentially Dr. Petri takes and he points out that as these two paths move together and they complement each other and they're competitive, that you get to a point essentially where China and the United States are the only two without links to everyone, basically, or themselves directly. And so it kind of raises a question to me, which is, as this process goes on, is it China and the United States that ultimately are driving this? Or are there other countries that could sort of tip the process one direction or the other? And one of the reasons I raise that is that I've actually had this conversation with some of the other TPP partners, and they'll talk about how once certain countries join the TPP, they believe it will create critical mass, if you will, which will essentially push everyone into TPP over time. So, is perhaps Dr. Jeong, Korea one of those countries? If Japan were to successfully join and to be a high-level FTA, is Japan that type of country that it pushes critical mass one way? Or does it not really matter one way or the other? A couple other thoughts real quick. Oh, yes. Dr. Lincoln, one of the things that I thought was really interesting about your paper and everything was when you start looking at how services is really changing sort of the U.S. approach and everything. One of the things that I might understand why this wasn't in there, just because it might be sort of beyond maybe what you saw as the scope. But when you look at services, the United States and USTR has recently started talking about this, has been discussing, well, not discussing, been considering the option of doing a services plurilateral agreement. So how does that sort of fit into U.S. trade policy and our vision? And does that then sort of impact TPP? In other words, if we move that way, could TPP become less attractive to us for other reasons, or do they both coexist with each other? And along those lines, one of the things I think would be interesting is sort of maybe deeper discussion of really how the United States approaches services trade. You know, we use a negative list, but most countries prefer a positive list. And so how does that filter into why we do that, and how, as we get into broader things, either be a plurilateral agreement or the TPP, how services trade might look in that? Well, I want to make sure we have time for audience questions and everything, so I think I'll leave it with those questions for the moment. And if you all would like to make a few comments on those, and then we'll open it up to the audience, perhaps.
Okay. You want to go with the same order we did before? Okay. Lots of interesting questions here. Let me start actually with one of your broader questions. Why should Korea do it? Good question, to which maybe I don't have the answer, but we raise one thing, which is that goes back to the point that I mentioned at the beginning, that every FTA agreement is different. And so you may have a country like Korea that has bilateral FTAs with all or most of the TPP members, but there may be differences in those agreements from what gets included in TPP. So if it ends up being, as Dr. Jeong suggested, the possibility of being a very high-quality agreement, it may exceed what was included in those bilateral agreements, which would be good for Korea. If you believe, as economists do, that being more open is better, then an agreement that forces or causes Korea to be more open would be to its benefit. On your question to me specifically on services, again, I don't know if I have a good answer to that. My guess is that you could have the U.S. government pursuing a plurilateral services agreement at the same time that it continues to put a fair amount of energy into TPP. My guess is that the problem would not be a policy one, should we go this direction, should we go that one, but simply a personnel issue. That one of the things we always have to keep in mind about U.S. trade policy is that USTR is a very small agency, roughly 180 people. And so how many negotiations they can actually conduct at any time is in fact fairly limited. So I think that's the thing that I would wonder about, that if you did the plurilateral one, would that soak up so many people or so many hours of work at USTR that somehow it might cause TPP to get less input? I don't know, but that's a possibility. And how we go about services, my casual impression actually is that what drives interest in services tends to be very country-specific and very industry-specific. So, for example, I think in the Chorus agreement, there was a great deal of interest on the part of the U.S. government trying to nail down a really good agreement on the financial sector, out of a belief that Korea has a rather well-developed financial sector. There's lots of money in Korea. There's lots of financial sector business to be done in Korea, and therefore we ought to move heavily in that direction. With an Indonesia or a Malaysia, maybe we wouldn't have that interest. So I think it's just specific to countries and where they are in terms of development and where the particular opportunities are.
Dr. Petri.
Thanks. I will also pick up on this question of what should Korea do, in part to provoke Dr. Jeong. It's the modeling results, and I think his results and ours are quite similar in this, suggest that the direct benefits to Korea of joining the TPP are not that large. And we understand why, because all of those economies are relatively liberal, and it already has FTAs with quite a few of them. So that's not surprising. There is a small direct benefit, even if you have FTAs with everybody, if you get yourself a TPP which in fact accumulates rules of origin. In other words, you can count as qualifying for the FTA products not just made in one country, but made in any of the countries of the zone in any combination, allows you to build these new production chains that might develop. So you can get some benefits from that, even if all the trade is already subject to independent FTAs just by consolidating the FTA. So there's that, and we do actually model that, not huge effects from that. The big question, it seems to me, is also one that Dr. Jeong referred to, is really what kind of trading system do you want in the end? You want one which is, Asian style, very open when it comes to intermediate input, when it comes to processing trade, not so open when it comes to final goods, and even less open when it comes to services or investment? Or do you want one which is, albeit the U.S. sometimes pushes these things too far, but nevertheless, do you want one which is basically rules-based and broad and comprehensive and open? And I would think that Korea is one of the countries which really does want that, so that to the extent that it can play a role in this set of dominoes which lead to that outcome rather than another outcome, that would be an important strategic objective. Now, let me add, by the way, is my recommendation would be do both. Why not? And you can do Asia and you can do TPP. Now, having said that, one of the ways I introduce to my class in international trade theory how negotiations work is by showing the YouTube video of the chorus agreement being passed in the Korean parliament. I don't know if you remember, which had the guy throwing tear gas and all that stuff. So, I think there's a lot of politics to this, and I understand the complexity of reopening those issues in a very difficult political context. But I would hope that the ultimate answer will be to push on as many fronts as you can, because it's ultimately the liberalization of the global system that is most in Korea's advantage.
Yes. China is now trying to conclude bilateral FTAs with Korea and also with Japan, and also they are promoting to conclude the CJK FTA. But if we conclude FTAs with China, that will not be a high-quality FTA. So, in that sense, it is much better for Korea to come to the CJK FTA first, because it is much better, much convenient to negotiate with China, because we have a similar position with Japan, so we can push China a little bit, open the more market, more service market, or more guarantee for the investments of us. But I want to stress here the CJK FTA, because this has a very significant meaning, because if you look at the ASEAN+3 summit meeting, then we are just guests, we are just invited there, and we have no voting right to something to get there. But we have now trilateral summit meeting here in CJK countries. So we are discussing not only the local or domestic issues, we are discussing also Asian issues, of the global issues. And the CJK GNP is account for almost 90% of the ASEAN+3. So without any CJK, FTA or CJK, there is no significant meaning in ASEAN integration. But there is also some problem we have to lose, because if you look at the FTAs in East Asian countries, these are polarized, because China and Asian countries conclude low quality FTAs, while Singapore, Japan, and Korea is trying to come to the high-level FTAs. So the problem is how we can smoothly resolve this problem. This is our problem we are facing regarding this Asian economic integration. I'm not against the TPP, but if we join the TPP, we have also some problems we have to lose because of the spaghetti ball effect. So there is some, of course, the multilateral framework like TPP is much more beneficial to satisfy the rules of origin regimes, but there is also some problems to solve this kind of regime because we have now ASEAN+1, 3 ASEAN+1 FTAs because CJK has concluded the FTAs with ASEAN. And if we conclude the bilateral FTA between China and Korea, and also CJK FTA, then we have many rules of origin regime. So we have to identify these rules of origin issue. This is the big obstacles to the Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. If you wouldn't mind, just please identifying yourself as well before your question. Yes.
Yeah, John Weatherby, University of South Carolina, Emeritus. I have two questions. First, Professor Petri, I'm not sure exactly how you would define the Asian track. Are we talking about converting the consultative framework of the APT? Is that into an FTA, or when we start talking about ASEAN +6, including Australia and New Zealand, or in one of the slides in your presentation, it confused me a little because the bar slide showing the differentials between the FPT and it said ASEAN rather than Asia, and so exactly what do we mean country by the Asian track? We're going back to the Australian suggestion. Exactly where are we? My second question is, what's in it for ASEAN as a group? And they're pushing and slouching towards the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015. There's enough incoherency already institutionally in ASEAN with the U.S. picking them off one by one for the TPP. It strikes me that this is going to weaken ASEAN as a grouping, and I'm not sure that's in the best interest of the United States.
Do you want to respond to the questions that come?
Yeah.
Good. They're very interesting questions. Obviously the research paper has all of the sort of country definitions, I hope, correctly identified. What we call the ASEAN, the Asian track is actually the ASEAN agreement, then the +1 agreements with Northeast Asia and others, and then the CJK, and all of that put together into what is the ASEAN +3 or the East Asian FTA. One could have equally well done the ASEAN +6 at the end, that is including also Australia, India, and which one am I forgetting?
New Zealand.
New Zealand. Though, then you've got India, and India is a very complicated country.
Does this leave Taiwan, does this leave Taiwan isolated?
All of them do.
Until the FTAP, because Taiwan is a member of APEC, so that once you build the FTAP, Taiwan. Also Russia comes in, which is very strange, but it does come in. And, but anyway, so we took basically the definitions of ASEAN +3 and the FTAP and built up. One could have done other scenarios, and they come out obviously slightly differently. diagrams, the slides for the scores of agreements were efforts to show differences in the types of agreements that different countries are concluding. We don't know yet what either the AFTA or the TPP agreement might look like. So what we can base it on is what the scores of agreements look like in the past. I just showed slides that show sharp contrasts between American style agreements and ASEAN style agreements. Your point about ASEAN is obviously right on, and they are worried about it, and they have from time to time expressed concerns about how this might undermine the region. It does have, as these things always do, it has both. It tends to undermine it. On the other hand, it exerts competitive pressure, which may be positive for it. So that there is an ASEAN++ template, which in fact is now attempting to deal with the integration of ASEAN agreements, the +1 agreements, into what might be a comprehensive agreement that solves, for example, rules of origin problems. So at the same time that it is providing some divisive pressure, it is also providing some pressure for progress. And the balance of that is hard to say. Thailand and the Philippines might very well be TPP partners not too long from now. Indonesia is further away from that. So it's hard to say. And then the question is, is ASEAN integration so fragile that it will depend on these external agreements to survive, or does it have through the AAC or other kind of internal institutions enough momentum to survive on the merits of that project?
This gentleman back here first.
I'm Jeong. I'm from Singapore actually. In my previous job, I was working on the ASEAN FTA. I was working in the ASEAN Secretariat. So I did my part in terms of improvising the ASEAN CER FTA, the Australian New Zealand as well as the ASEAN ROK. I want to go back to Dr. Jeong's point about high-level FTA, high-level PTA. It seems to me that there is definitely a correlation that for a FTA to be high level, there's a relation, or there's definitely a connection to the size of the economy. The smaller you are, the easier for you to open up the higher level the FTAs. Which brings me back to, I think, either Peter or Edward's point earlier about the possibility of China and US being shut out in a regional trade agreement. Because given the size that it is, put it this way, they are both hegemons. It's just like South Asia FTA. India is a hegemon. That's why South Africa can never move. Likewise for Mercosur. Brazil is such a big country. It's a big economy. So once you have a hegemon, once you have an elephant in the setup, it's slower to move. Is this possibly the way forward when we come about all the small economies, like-minded economies coming together? We kick out the big boys because we don't need the big boys to survive. Is this likely to be indications, say, come 2050? I don't know, because now, increasingly, I think since we are talking about one country, one vote system in the international platform, this could be a real possibility that one day we may not need the US, we may not need the India, we may not need the China. The smaller countries all come together, high-level FTA is what you all call it. So great, we'll be grateful to have your comments. Thanks.
Anyone want to take in comment on that?
You have to answer.
Yeah, the size of the economy. Of course, this is important factors to open the market. Imagine that Singapore is a small country; it's more easier to open up to the outside, and Hong Kong and the Dubai also. But that isn't everything. This is not all. The important thing is the willingness of opening the market. This is the critical point to reach the highest standard FTAs. And also the internal resistance. This is also the important factors. So let's say in Japan, they have very strong resistance in internal resistance in society, but that is also critical factor. But The thing is, if we conclude ASEAN+3 FTA, EA FTA, then we can secure also the Chinese hegemony a little bit by using all the ASEAN voting, because they are all small countries, but they can vote, and they can also contain the Chinese hegemony toward the East Asia. So the United States is promoting the TPP issues to contain the Chinese hegemony toward the East Asia, but we can also contain the China's hegemony to the East Asia. This is one of my comment. And second thing is, I think the most favorable path to the East Asian integration is we have to conclude first the CJK FTA, and then we have to expand the ASEAN+3. This is most feasible, and then ASEAN+6. But it is very difficult to conclude a really high standard FTA because there are so big differences in development stages and institutional stages. So, but there is also significant meaning to conclude the CJK plus PEM FTA, this East Asia FTA, because in an East Asia there is no economic integration system like NATO, NAFTA or something like this. But important thing is to reach such kind of integration in East Asia, we need the United States support. If you look back then the process of the European integration process, the United States was harmonizer, fertilizer for the whole process. So without any of this kind of supports, we cannot reach our goals here in East Asia integration. Because the United States now wanted to just bilateral relations between the United States and China or the United States and Korea. But with this kind of policy, we cannot reach, maybe we cannot reach the East Asian integration.
Could I just a bit? I guess I have more questions than answers, but I take your point about small countries getting together without having the elephant in the room. And you know, I had been quite encouraged when ASEAN moved in that direction. You know, at the beginning of the 1990s, said, yeah, you can do it. And yet that agreement and the implementation of it has been, well, shall we say, relatively low-level quality FTA. You know, there are persistent stories that a lot of ASEAN-based companies don't even bother applying for the duty-free treatment because it's too onerous to do the paperwork, kind of thing. And yet, you would have thought that it would have served both an economic purpose and a political purpose. Economically, both make ASEAN more attractive for foreign direct investment, say, relative to China. If you could produce a product in Thailand or Malaysia or Indonesia and then ship it to any one of the other ASEAN countries duty-free. It has a population advantage of again, relative to China. You know, look at ASEAN. We're one economic bloc. Yeah, not quite as big as China, but almost half the size in terms of population. And then politically, clearly there has been an effort in ASEAN to play collectively as ASEAN a role in economic and other issues. Hence, you know, ASEAN+3, ASEAN+6. You know, the ASEAN+3 meetings that started in the late 1990s. My impression is that ASEAN government is very proud of the fact that it was their initiative, not the Japanese, not the Koreans, not the Chinese. And so you think that, yes, you could do more, and that leaves me a little bit puzzled as to why there hasn't been more aggressive economic integration than there has. But at least there's some.